Translators of Reddit, what is the most disturbing thing you have had to translate? I had a short career as a court interpreter, usually for easy stuff like do-Is and please. I quit after this one case. Armed robbery in a store where victim was abused. I represented the victim in court, which meant that I had to say everything the perpetrator did in first-person point of view, word for word of the victim's account. To say it was uncomfortable was the understatement of the century. That messed me up quite a bit. Story 2. Translating Al-Qaeda Constitution for a college essay, only to get barely passable note because of political reasons. Things weren't ducked up on paper. We want to create Islamic Caliphate. Blah blah, but reading and translating declassified US document with redacted names made me think like I was suspicious. I've put ISIS song trap remix to lighten up, match the mood. Story 3. When my French friend had met one of my American friends, and they started flirting and dirty talking. I had to translate back and forth. Let me tell you, hearing how your American guy friend is going to damn you hot French friend. So hard she's going to be numb and forget she's French. Then having to translate to French, then having to translate your French friend saying she's his idiot is pretty damn awkward and disturbing. They ditched me and TBH. I'm fine with that. Don't ever want to translate for them again. Story 4. Not sure if this counts, and I'm not a translator, but I'm sure it was uncomfortable for the person communicating in between. When I was a teenager, about 17 years ago, I received a call from what I now know as a telecommunications relay service used by deaf people where the operator speaks word for word what the person is typing. The operator was a female conveying messages from some guy who I've never heard the name of. Let's call him Troy. Troy knew my name and he said things like how much he missed hanging out with me and how hot I was and that he recently got in an accident which caused them to be deaf. He said he loved my and described through the operator all the things that he would love to do to it. Obviously, I'm thinking this is a friend playing a joke and said so and kept asking who it really was. Troy just reiterated his name and started saying things like he was upset that I don't remember who he is and that I apparently wasn't the good person he originally thought he was, etc., etc. Unfortunately, the call got dropped, or the operator hung up from how uncomfortable the conversion was getting, I'm not sure. But I still, to this day, have no clue it was that called me. None of my friends had any idea who it could have been either. Story 5. A badly recorded and garbled video made in a hospital for children with developmental issues. It was not fun. The worst part was when a girl's parents were discussing something and the mom mentioned other children. And then the father said something like, "Other children don't want to play with daughter's name." For a few seconds after that, he looked like he was going to break down. But then he managed to collect himself, clapped his hands in a gesture of hopeless acceptance, and started playing with his barely coherent child. Story 6. I volunteered for almost 3 years translating victim statements from Spanish to English for an immigration attorney. The office is part of a non-profit legal aid clinic. So often the clients were people in really desperate situations. Long story short, many American citizens will marry foreign nationals and then wield deportation as a weapon to enable ongoing domestic abuse. So usually, but not exclusively, men will woo and marry a woman, bring her to the USA or make her promises about helping her stay here, and then do whatever they want to her. Because these women are not citizens, they're terrified to go the authorities. Their abusers take full advantage of that. The victims endure so much, especially when they have children to consider. In reality, there are legal avenues victims can pursue to get out of that situation and still remain on a path to citizenship. That's what the attorney specializes in, helping non-citizen victims of domestic abuse get divorced without jeopardizing their standing as legal residents. The most disturbing things always had to do with children. Describing in detail how kids as young as toddlers get beaten, bruised, and broken by trying to intervene when one parent is mercilessly attacking the other broke my heart every time. Black eyes and broken arms, wrists. When the abuser swings, throws the child out of the way, were so common. And these victim statements were written from a victimized parent's perspective, which was just so raw and emotional. It was hard to read about a child being harmed, and it was even harder to hear that abuse described in as much detail as possible firsthand through the eyes of so many victimized mothers who blame themselves. Story 7. The most disturbing thing I ever had to translate was that during a job interview, my customer wanted me to translate from German that his daughter owns this place and is going to bomb it. But I knew he wasn't serious, so I told the manger that he really wanted the job because his daughter begged him to get it. Story 8. I was in hospital waiting room on the maternity unit. A very distressed woman came in and didn't speak English. They found a translator, had to wait a while, and he went in to see the doctor with her. He had to translate to her that she was miscarrying. She had literally no one to help her in this country. I really felt for her and for the translator. Story 9. Journal entries my client had pretty obviously stolen from his coworker at a bar. Emails between a guy and his mistress, sent to me by a woman who was either his wife or daughter. Messages from the leader of a cult religious group to his followers. Tons and tons of gross medical stuff. Never list dermatology as a field of expertise unless you have a strong stomach. Story 10. I'm not a translator, but I did have to use a Japanese translator one time, and he had to do some pretty disturbing translating for my family and I. Long story short, my family and I live in the US. My dad got a job working on an Air Force base in Japan for an 8-month contract. He got very ill while in Japan working on the base and was admitted to a hospital in Tokyo. No one in the entire hospital spoke English. They wouldn't let us use a translator to get any updates on my dad, as they said they could only speak directly to family. His condition was very bad within the first 12 hours he was there. He was in the ICU. We had a local friend that knew someone who spoke Japanese. He agreed to make the call to the hospital and lie saying he was my father's brother, so he could get information from them about my dad's status. It was a 3-way call. My brother, my mom, and I just listened as he spoke Japanese with the people at the hospital getting information about my dad. After the call, he told us that the doctor at the hospital said that my dad wouldn't make it through another night and had gone into cardiac arrest about 45 minutes prior. I've never met the man who made the call for us, but I'm sure it threw kink into his day. Story 11. This is a story a woman told me who is a Spanish-English translator for courts across Middle Georgia. There was a custody case between an ex-husband and wife over their young daughter, around 7 years old. The woman alleged that the ex-husband abused their daughter and described some really awful crap. The daughter was brought up to testify. She corroborated everything. After she answered all the questions and described everything that she was asked if that was everything, she replied, with a big smile according to my friend, "Yep, that's everything." Just like my mommy told me to say it, she said the court was dead silent. Story 12. I worked as a video game translator for 7 years, and in slow months that did not pay the bills, so I took on jobs from other clients. I did a lot of adult films work, including video descriptions and tags, very educational, but also really disturbing at times, of course, with the fetish, which is such a loosely used term category, being the wildest guess before I actually got the texts. In hindsight, I'm still surprised none of that rubbed off, on me. Another huge part of the language market is translating material for mission churches, mainly evangelical. Not being a religious person, I didn't mind that at first. But when I delved more deeply into the topic and read up on how these churches are basically trying to con their way into positions of power globally, I refused to pick up any more jobs from them, even in the slowest months. Other jobs I've done were in online gambling, which was always really well paid and easy work, if you use the right tools. But whenever I was working on those, I felt a bit complicit in their business model, which does feed on addiction, no doubt about it. The weirdest phase, also mildly disturbing, was my stint as copy translator for a high-end luxury travel promoter. Basically, they were selling these incredibly lavish tour packages to rich people. I'm talking safari lodge with personal butler, 400-foot yacht with crew and all fresh buffet flown in by helicopter every morning crap here. That was so far above what I imagine rich people do on vacation. It blew my mind. I've done a lot of volunteer work for Translators Without Borders to atone for my sins. Story 13. Not personally a translator, but when I worked as a medical scribe in oncology, we had virtual interpreters for our patients that didn't speak English. One day, a translator tuned in to an office visit, and she was very chipper until she realized that she had to tell the patient that they were dying from their aggressive cancer, and they only had a week or so to live. We all cried together. Story 14. Translator here. I once had to translate a contract worth several million USD between my country's government and a pseudoscientific company. The whole thing was obviously a fraud, as the government agreed to pay all that money in exchange for some fictional, not yet proven technology that was supposed to produce clean energy, and I couldn't say a word to anybody because of an NDA. They would have come after my ass. Story 15. I visited a friend in Hungary 2 years ago, and he introduced me to a female friend who ran a hostel and taught piano. She asked for some help ironing out the English in this article she had written so she could get it published in a more visible place. I agreed, thinking I just had to review and make a few corrections. When I got back, she emailed me an installment. The article was supposed to concern world peace and the Jewish idea of the Messiah. In practice, it supported a world collectivist government in a way that I found a bit disturbing. The language was repetitive and abstract, the arguments were simplistic, and the more I read, the more I disagreed with the ideas. But a promise is a promise. I could barely understand her English version, so I had to auto-translate each sentence and then go back and synthesize the two versions. Even so, it was sometimes difficult to understand it well enough to make a third, more polished version. I'm not a professional translator, and it was slow and excruciating work, but I finished the section and sent it back. About a month for 10 pages, working an hour every few days. So I guess I appeared lazy and uncaring, but I couldn't bear to tell her how bad it was. Then she sent another one, and after that another one. It was endless, and it didn't get any better. I felt horrible about being slow, but couldn't find the time or energy to speed it up. After 15 sections, she got cancer and passed within a few months. This was tragic. I felt so bad for her, and make matters worse, I hadn't completed this important thing for her which had given her life meaning. So I thought I would at least honor her memory by getting it in print posthumously somewhere. My friend suggested an online literary magazine which he had written for. So maybe that will work, but it will require more time to pull everything together. Just goes to show, among other things, that most of life's worst problems are self-created problems. Story 16. I volunteered doing some translating, interpreting for an asylum clinic. My client was my age, from Cuba. I translated his written testimony as well as interpreting for him while the lawyer asked him questions about it. And this man detailed how his whole adult life he's been singled out because he doesn't support the regime. He's been denied career opportunities and advancements and had to put up with random inspections of his business. That went on for a few years. But he became a problem when he tried to vote against the party. I don't remember exactly, but the vote was very much a sham. He voted no for whatever it was they wanted, and he was tracked down and beaten at his own home in front of his family. He continued to be a problem for them, and this is where it gets bad. He was arrested a few different times and detained, beaten up, and sent back home. But the last time he was held for 72 hours in a cell, no food or water, beaten randomly. He was pistol whipped and broke a few teeth. Some more things that are a lot more graphic and that he really struggled to tell. He was told he and his family would be disappeared if he didn't cooperate. From there, he managed to get a visa to Nicaragua and basically hitchhiked his way to the States. He applied for asylum and spent 6 months in a jail until his case was heard. I'm not sure what became of his case, but the way he described what was done to him was haunting. The fear in both his writing and his voice when he told his story was very real. I tried my best to convey the power behind his words in English. The thing that I remember best was when he wrote, "I want to be in America because here you can have your own opinion and nobody can take that away from you. I hope he's doing well." Story 17. I had a relative who translated games from English to German for IA. His English is excellent. My German is rusty, but occasionally he wanted input from a native English speaker. He was stumped on "you're crazy," and I couldn't really offer any help on that one beyond something that flings a gross substance. Story 18. We did a hit on this compound that turned out had a bunch of women locked in cages. We found a bunch of Taliban propaganda that I thought was pretty creepy, and apparently worked since the women kept trying to crawl back into their cages. Real Muslims, meaning in actuality followers of the pure religion of Islam. Everyone who ever disobeys Islam or its holy Quran, in Arabic, we seek refuge in Allah, is in essence disobeying themselves. Something in Arabic, which is immediately translated for Pashtuns in the next line. Translation. When reasons for happiness, celebration become apparent, and the drinking of alcohol starts then, at that time, it starts to enter the ground and change form. Pretty much they change form when they drink alcohol. Pictured below is a wife of Omani, probably a reference to the Quran or something else cultural, whose form has changed to that of an animal. Reportedly, that's the worn away part, when aforementioned woman was engaged watching a music channel and her mother was reciting the Holy Quran, she said to her mother, "I'm tired of listening to Quran recitation. If you want to recite, you can go somewhere else and leave here." The woman's mother rejected that, and the daughter took the Holy Quran from her mother's grasp and threw it on the ground, and at once the girl's form changed to that of an animal. The girl is currently still living and is under observation in a government hospital. This story has been received. Looks like some information was omitted, or that last bit would make sense. Story 19. Not really a translator story, but a very vanilla coworker who was not tech-savvy at all. Either got a text from her husband, which was a meme with a peach or some other fruit that represents lady parts and implied sex, and she asked me what it meant. She turned beet red like no way. "Ma'am, yes way, eyebrow lift, eyebrow lift, eyebrow lift." Story 20. I am thankful that my great-grandmother is still somehow alive, but I hate that she still has to live in such a ducked-up world. A year ago, a kid by the name of Junior was mistaken for somebody else and was beaten by a group of people in the Bronx near where my buddy lives. The group left Junior, friend, and he was taken to the hospital by a stranger. However, he passed. I went to my grandpa's house because he wanted to see his oldest grandkid. His 90-year-old mother lived in his building, but upstairs. Because we are Dominican and we have millions of relatives, our relatives took up an entire floor and a half. There were 4 apartments a floor and there were 5 floors. Anyways, my grandpa and great-grandma speak absolutely no English. When my grandpa went to the boiler room after a complaint about the heater being broken since he is the super, I turned on the English news. This was my mistake. A segment was playing about the whole story. My great-grandma asked me what they were saying, and since I was almost entirely fluent, I told her in Spanish about a story of a boy being mistaken for a guy who was doing the mattress mambo with somebody in the group's girlfriend and beaten and hacked with a machete. She yelled out, "I, Santa Maria." I remembered that this was my great-grandma and that she is the sweetest thing ever and that I shouldn't have told her. Story 21. I volunteered as a translator for refugees in Serbia, mostly Pakistani guys. One time, this guy spoke no English, only Urdu, and so I, a 20-year-old with no experience or knowledge of psychological therapy, was asked to translate in a therapy session. This guy had a childhood girlfriend, who he was going to marry, but she suddenly passed due to some sickness. They fought the last time they had talked, and so he placed all guilt upon himself of her end, of not being with her, of causing her sickness. This man was gaunt. I've never seen someone so debilitated by stress. His eyes were bloodshot with dark bags underneath. An array of horizontal cut marks, almost like a parade, filled his arms. He told me he would cut himself every day at 4 p.m. because that is when she passed. He would just get this compulsion, and he wouldn't be able to stop himself. He would break a glass bottle and just slice at the first spot on his arm that could take it. There were a lot of conversations I had, but this one always stuck to me because of the utter dejection and hopelessness this man was experiencing. Also quite difficult to do as there is little concept of therapy in Pakistan. And the lowest class of people in the country have always been downtrodden and robbed of self-expression. The education system definitely does not ask for it. This man was being asked to express his feelings and his opinion for one of the very few times in his life, so I had to coax it out of him. Story 22. I speak a lesser-known language that is spoken in Nova Scotia, Scotland, and some parts of Australia and New Zealand. The language is called Scottish Gaelic. Me and my friends went to this immersion program where we could speak nothing but the language. And I was the most fluent out of my friends. So naturally, I was the translator. One of my friend's moms got really into it and even texted him in only Gaelic, mind you. I thought his mom spoke the language fluently. And I also mind you that it is a lesser-known language, so if you know it, you most likely don't teach it to your kids. Anyways, back to the story. I thought she was completely fluent in the language, but she only used Google Translate, but surprisingly, it was correct. Well, until one morning when she asked him what he ate. Naturally, he told her bacon and eggs. He'd thought he would be polite and ask her back, and what Google Translate came up with genuinely terrified me. What she meant to say was that she had eaten a breakfast sandwich, but Google Translate came up with heads. I looked at the screen for a second and was frozen. I didn't even know how to respond. Luckily, my friend told me she was using Google Translate and the situation blew over. But damn, I thought my friend was going to start nibbling at my arm halfway through the night. Story 23. I'm a first-generation Hispanic child where my parents didn't speak English since they were fresh immigrants from Mexico. Luckily, I was born here. Police once came to our condo, and since I was closest to the front door, I answered. The policeman asked if he can speak to my parents, and I said sure, but they don't speak English. They asked if I can be a big boy and translate to them what's going on. I had to translate that there is an abuser in the neighborhood that looked like a picture he showed. The guy would go out once every few nights and abuse a mother that he stalked for a few days to know their schedule. I was deeply disturbed to know that word at a very young age, and even worse translating that to my parents in front of a police officer. Story 24. I used to work in a counseling project for children and families who had been abused. Part of the job was transcribing the therapist's notes for the sessions with clients. I've read and heard things that I think a lot of people here wouldn't be able or want to imagine. Although the subject matter was often horrific, it did make a difference knowing that the kids and their families were getting the help they needed. Story 25. Not seriously disturbing, but I translated a number of Google search terms for dirty actions. It was very educational. At about the same time, the company I worked for was asked to translate some legal but really disturbing stuff about pedo. My boss had a principle to never say no and always return with an offer. He made sure the offer was way out of the budget for the job. Close call. Story 26. A patient had hemorrhoids. Described to me in full detail what it was like. Since the patient didn't know how to send an email, I received the picture by text and forwarded to the doctor. Never thought I would see another guy's butt area TBH. Story 27. I'm not a professional translator, but I hung out with a Portuguese guy a lot and spent a huge amount of my time at his house with his family, who were all born in Portugal and barely spoke English. And I was taught how to be conversational in their language for when family visited. One day I get a call from the grandma. Their dad was an addict and passed of heart disease, and they all had different moms, so the grandmother was the one who raised all 6 kids, asking me to come over, and she was crying. So I jumped up and literally ran the 4 kilometers there because the next bus was an hour's wait. I get there and the cops were everywhere with an ambulance, and she's sobbing. Turned out my friend's, who was at his mom's almost 1,000 kilometers away, younger brother take his life away. I was handed the note and asked to read it to them in Portuguese because the cops didn't have a translator who spoke Portuguese. I read it too. Her and my heart broke with every word, and the look on her face when I was finished killed me. I did my best to comfort her, but there was duck. All I could do to help that kind of hurt. Ever since I have refused to speak Portuguese because I had never seen words hurt someone so much. Story 28. I'm going to need to put some background on this one. My grandfather was the head of a large church, full of immigrants from Haiti, as a result of the many refugees that came to America after the earthquakes. There were many Haitians who spoke no English at the church, and so the sermons were mostly given in Creole. Many of the people worked terrible jobs and were very poor. My grandfather, who had been in the States for a while, spoke English fairly well and helped his church members find jobs. He would help translate certain documents for them, and often I would help, because I was born in America and had a solid grasp on English, Creole, and French. There was a day where my grandfather and I went to talk to a man who wanted to file a report on the managers of a chicken factory he had worked for, but wasn't sure how to do it because of his inability to speak or read English. The details of what was going on in the facility was terrifying. That particular man had his arm crushed to bits by a machine his employers gave him no instructions on how to use. And many of the workers there suffered similar problems and were let go by the company with broken arm. Lots of illegal stuff going on in those factories. And to hear that stuff as a kid was horrific. Story 29. Not exactly a translator, but I translated on various occasions. I was a student nurse, very new to the scene. It was probably my second year in the course, and we had regular clinical attachments in local hospitals every vacation. One instance, I had a patient who had to go for surgery. Of course, one of the risks of anesthesia that goes with surgery includes death. I was explaining this to an 80-year-old lady who was already anxious about her situation. She only spoke a certain language, and I was the only one there who could speak it. I had to translate the word death in a way that wouldn't scare her further. But how do you do that? Nobody taught me how to say that in nursing. I bluntly translated that phrase to her, and she burst into tears. She left the next morning. Another instance happened in the same school year. A patient of mine, probably a 40-year-old man, was dying of a heart attack in the ward. It was too sudden, but looking at his medical records, he wouldn't survive the night. The doctor called his wife to inform regarding his dying situation. The moment she arrived, I had to translate the doctor's words of "he will not make it. Please go see him now." And I felt so bad. He passed in the next half hour. Story 30. My friend was struck by a drunk driver who veered off the road into the park we were in. A lot of injuries. While my friend was in the hospital clinging to life, I met her family there and answered all of their questions about the incident. Out of nowhere, the entire extended family of the drunk driver showed up at the hospital and came to see my friend. The drunk driver's family only spoke Spanish. The victim's family only spoke English. I am fluent in both, so I translated the sorrow and horror of the drunk driver's family to the victim's family and translated back the difficult responses of the victim's family. They all ended up crying together with bitter tears by the end. It was very painful, emotional, tense, surreal, and I still haven't fully processed it, even though it happened years ago. The victim's family, while terse, were very elegant and kindly in their responses. My friend now lives a normal life after a year of learning to walk again and has even started running. There is growth after tragedy. Story 31. In high school, we had a foreign exchange student program. As far as I knew, the program had to ensure the kids could speak decently fluent English to be able to enter the program. Well, I ended up getting called out of class to speak to our new student from France. My dad is French. He basically spoke no English and had no way of communicating to his host family. He had to spend months in a foreign place where he basically understood nothing. My family was quite literally the only ones in our small community who could efficiently communicate with him. I felt so awful for him. Story 32. Sorry for answering this while not necessarily a translator. However, I was fluent in American Sign Language for about 5 years before slowly forgetting most of it due to issues with my memory. I was at the mall with my friend, and we were chilling in the food court when I noticed two deaf people, a male and a female, having a conversation in sign language. It was interesting seeing how aggressive the conversation seemed, so I started to pay attention to see what was being said. I don't remember the exact details, but these are the important parts. The woman kept telling the man he was disgusting and horrible, and he just repeatedly signed sorry. She then told him she was going to tell his wife and that she was going to report him to the police. He was very distraught and kept begging her not to. The woman then got mad and signed, "You had sex with your own niece." So that's when I stopped paying attention because that was a very unfortunate thing to see. Story 33. At my school, I was the translator for a debate between a Russian group and Spanish group at the debating club, and the Russian group started making threats in Russian, such as, towards the Spanish group's leader, "I will take your brother and hide him away." The next week, the Spanish team's leader's brother was reported missing. The good news is, it was for only about 10 hours at one of the Russian group's house. Story 34. I was appointed translator in 4th grade when a girl that only spoke Spanish joined our class. I had the privilege of translating her fight with another girl that got way too uncomfortably sexual for me. Stuff like, "You like to make love to the hobo down the street." Story 35. Accounts of Palestinians tortured in Israeli prisons for international humanitarian reports. I wouldn't speak to anyone or leave the house for a week after that. I stopped eating bananas for months because one particular form of positioning torture was called the banana. The details were harrowing. It was too much so. After that, I stuck to cultural and academic translation. Years later, I still think of it when I see news reports on human rights violations anywhere. The human soul is ugly and malicious. Story 36. I worked as a relay operator for a few months many years ago. For those that don't know, a relay service is how deaf people use the phone. They have a machine called a titai that displays text. They type text into that machine. It comes to a relay operator's computer screen, and they read that message to the hearing person on the other line. Okay, now that I've explained what the job is. There was one night there, I was the relay operator for a deaf girl and her hearing boyfriend. They got in an argument about something stupid, and she told me to hang up on him, so I did. Then she gave me a new phone hash to call. It was her side piece. I then had to be the relay operator for them having phone sex with each other. I didn't last much longer at that job after that. Story 37. This is more of a sad thing. My stepmom isn't a professional translator, but grew up speaking Spanish and translated for some schools in my area during parent-teacher conferences and stuff like that. One day, she was called and asked to be put into a conference call with a Spanish-speaking parent. She had to translate that the father was neglectful and abusive, and that she was withdrawing the kids from school, and they were moving across the country to live with her family. My stepmom said her heart broke hearing and translating everything she did. The kids didn't know they were leaving until last minute. No one at school that was friends with the oldest, he was in my grade, knew they were leaving. Story 38. I interpret over the phone for English, Chinese Mandarin, and I absolutely hate it when the Mandarin person starts to add English into their sentences. I had one time with this lady where she spoke half her sentence in barely intelligible English. And she sounds like she's talking through an elephant's ass with a phone from the 20, and it's impossible to understand her. And when I told her she needs to repeat slowly, she got angry at me and said to the English-speaking person on the other end that I'm not good at my job. Story 39. Perhaps not disturbing, but for a final in my interpreting program, I had to interpret a simulated call to a strip club without knowing until the simulation started. The only thing I knew beforehand was that I was interpreting a call to a restaurant, and someone was making reservations. The guy making the call asked if he could have sex with the escort, and the guy who worked for the strip club at one point said, "Nah man, we're just titties." And I had to interpret that El Mao. I got a 100 preprint on the final though, so it was worth it. Story 40. I was a freelance interpreter for immigration lawyers. Many of their clients, at least the ones I was asked to interpret for, were refugees that spoke little or no English. Some of them had stories telling how they were brutally and mercilessly tortured in prison, or when they were subjected to unspeakable abuse. I only did that for a short time, over 10 years ago, and they still haunt me to this day. Interpreting something like this is far worse than just listening to it, because you have to hear it and process it in your brain, then reassemble it into a completely different language. Story 41. Hope I don't get flagged for this, but here goes. In 2017, we were fighting a legal battle. We were rightfully acquitted in court after a long legal battle. And my damn country prosecution doesn't make their investigations properly prior to take someone to court. There was one time that an inmate in there wanted to give a letter to someone. Don't remember who, because we seriously got disturbed for its contents. Just to clarify, no illegal stuff was ever within the letter, but the content was kind of gut-wrenching. Thing is, I live in a Spanish-speaking country, and the letter was fully written in English. And guess who was the one translating it? Long story short, we decided to burn the letter because we felt really uneasy by it. I could get into detail about it, but I'll leave it at that. Those of you who work as language interpreters, or have in the past, what is the most awkward or uncomfortable conversation that you have had to convey? I was a missionary, 20 years old, working with Asian refugees in California. I ended up spending a lot of time translating for folks who spoke little to no English, mostly doctor appointments, talking with utility companies about bills, reading official documents from the INs or their kids' schools. Anyway, one woman asked me to translate for her at court. I told her I wasn't certified by the state, but she clarified that the case was against her son, who spoke English. She just wanted to know what was going on, so I went. It turned out to be an abuse trial. 4 guys, 2 teenage girls. It was bad. Story 3. I work tech support and often have to use a language line. My favorites are Asian languages, and when people are pissed. The interpreters, bless their hearts, will faithfully translate, but every so often will say, they are saying not kind things about you personally. Story 4. My cousin is a sign language interpreter, and he says a big problem he and his clients have is that people talk to him rather than the client, even at really important things like doctor appointments. The doctor will spend ages asking my cousin where he learned BSL while the deaf client just wants to get their medical issue looked at. It's against policy for my cousin to hold their own conversation with the doctor when he's working. as he's only there to help the client understand what people are saying. He and his clients find it really frustrating and rude. So basically, if you see someone with a sign language interpreter, you can literally just ignore the interpreter, and everyone will prefer it that way, as they can just get on with their job. Also, one of his first ever clients saw his doctor was Indian and signed, "Where's my curry?" That was pretty damn awkward, especially when the doctor then asked what the sign meant. Story 5. I was interpreting for a high school teacher who was participating in an event to try to get dropouts to come back to HS in a majority Hispanic neighborhood. Anyway, the school gave us a list with addresses that we had to go to try to persuade the kids' parents. We go to this one house and ring the bell. The mother answers. I start translating what the teacher was saying, and we go back and forth with the mother, asking her to see the kid. Let's call her Maria. The mom kept insisting we couldn't talk to Maria, and the teacher kept giving the whole spiel about dropping out and to think of the future, etc., about 10 minds into the conversation. The frustrated teacher wants me to ask the mother why on earth couldn't we talk to Maria, to which the mother breaks down crying and says that she passed a week before from a long illness. That's why she had dropped out. Ensues the worst and most awkward, maybe 5 minute of our lives, between apologies and condolences. Needless to say, we didn't go to any other house that day. BDW, the school turns out was aware of the kid's passing, but had forgotten to take her out of the list. Story 6. I've been on multiple medical trips to Mexico with my urologist father. Bringing translators that have little to no medical experience is incredibly difficult. And in no one knows the different names for instruments. Differs between states, countries. I've sat in on multiple appointments and surgeries with translators, and by far the worst is when my dad makes the usually very religious translators talk about health. In addition, oftentimes people only speak Mayan in this particular village, so there has to be an English to Spanish translator and a Spanish to Mayan translator. Story 7. I wasn't a translator, but I worked at a place that captioned telephone calls for customers who were hard of hearing. We only heard one side of the phone call, then basically repeated what we heard into our voice recognition software and then corrected it on the fly. Most of the conversation were boring as hell old people talking to other old people. 50 people in a row calling in to vote for Dancing with the Stars. But ever so rarely you get a good one. Mine was what I'm assuming was a deaf young lady and her boyfriend, because the conversation very quickly turned from, "How are you doing?" to, "I want to tie you spread eagle on the bed and lick you all over." This continued for about 15 minutes, but the best part is all the cubicles around you hearing you loudly and very clearly speak, so the voice recognition doesn't duck up. Graphic sex acts while they are trying not to lose their crap laughing and still keep up captioning an old lady's cookies recipe. Story 8. I was a conversation teacher for adults in Japan who wanted to practice more natural English, not strict formal grammar, but conversational. Not quite an interpreter, but one student was an 80-year-old man the others called Mr. Dictionary, because his vocab was seriously exhaustive. There were very few words that could stump him, usually some type of slang. On the rare occasion he brought a printout to ask about a new word, I would get both excited and nervous to see what it was. This was in 2007. One day he pulls out a paper and says, "I heard a news story about a scandal with an American radio host insulting some athletes. Please tell me, what does this mean?" And with all eyes in the class waiting for my wise translation, he loudly and carefully pronounced, "Nappy-headed hose." Story 9. I'm a translator, which means I only work with the written word. Not normally anything particularly juicy. However, I once had to deal with a landlord writing to Facebook to try and get Facebook to take down derogatory comments from his tenants. Basically, the landlord was accused of giving apartments to people who would sleep with him. So I had to translate a whole bunch of comments calling him a horn dog, saying the whole tower block had been under his desk, etc. Someone called him the Lidl version of Dominique Strauss-Kahn, which I thought was pretty hilarious. I actually did once have to interpret between a woman having a stroke and a first aider, not as a professional interpreter, just happened to be there and speak her language. I did okay at getting her info and keeping her calm, waiting for the ambulance. But then the paramedics wanted me to tell her that she was probably having a stroke, and I couldn't remember the word, so I said she was having a brain attack. Story 10. This may not be awkward, uncomfortable per se, but I once worked for an American teacher in Taiwan who expected his interpreters to be able to translate puns into another language. He did not, or would not understand that a pun in English isn't a pun in Chinese. Story 11. There are a few. One of the worst is having to relay bad news, like cancer diagnosis, especially when the doctor is extremely blunt or hurried. As an interpreter, you cringe and wish you could change even just the tone or the insensitive wording to make it sound more humane. But you really shouldn't, because as an interpreter, your job is to relay the info as closely as possible. Another difficult situation is when you're called to a patient that is coding. This was especially difficult when I worked with pediatric patients at the children's hospital and trying to calm down the frantic parents. Another one is being called to the ER and then upon arriving, finding out it's a person I know outside of work, like a family friend. In that situation, I would try to get someone else to interpret because of ethics. But it's still a tough situation because you want to help as much as you can while you wait on someone else to take over. I honestly could go on, but these are usually the exceptions as I love my job. There's just some days that are more difficult than others. Story 12. My most awkward, uncomfortable moment by far was when I had to interpret for an Iraqi national who was briefly detained by the British Army in the early years of the war and was seeking compensation for it. The poor guy had been rounded up with a bunch of friends, co-workers, beaten senselessly, and abused more than once. That was a rather painful conversation. Story 13. Most uncomfortable for me was interpreting at a mental health facility, and a patient walked over to the payphone in the day room, sat down, grabbed the phone, and wrapped it around his neck before pushing his chair out from under himself. Most uncomfortable for other people in the audience was interpreting a sex education curriculum training for teachers. I was in heaven because it's not often. I get to use all the sex-relate signs, but it was funny to see. So many adults who were so embarrassed by talking about sex. Also sad that they would be taking that shame, embarrassment back to the classroom. Story 14. Similar to others, not an actual translator, but my parents spoke poor English when I was younger. When I was 12 years old, they filed for bankruptcy and took me to the lawyer's office to translate for them. Having them go through and tell me everything they blew money on was extremely uncomfortable. Now, as an adult, they get offended when I don't want to take financial advice from them. Story 15. I was interpreting for an elementary-age deaf girl. She was having trouble understanding an issue at school, and some of the other students started mocking her. I had to interpret their insults to her. I felt absolutely torn apart by that. Story 16. I was a Spanish medical translator for a while, and there were some pretty bad ones, but one really stands out above the rest. I followed a nurse into a room where the patient was waiting. Now, I know nothing about the patient. I'm only there to translate what the nurse says, so when the nurse says, "You're pregnant," I gave a huge smile and went, "You're pregnant," in Hispanic. Patient stares in shock for a second, and then bursts into tears. The nurse stammers a bit, and then goes, "No bueno?" Not good. The news we had to give was bad enough, but the fact that I thought it was supposed to be a happy announcement made it 10x more cringe. Story 17. Not the interpreter, and not deaf, but I attended a comedy performance that had a female interpreter on stage with the comedian. For context, the interpreter was provided by the university, and it was the comedian's first experience being interpreted. He decided to make jokes about the situation, including, at one point, wondering aloud how the word bra would be signed, and watching the interpreter for the answer. She got to the important word, and decided to fingerspell. I was highly amused. Story 18. I'm an immigration officer who works with inadmissible aliens, people who are not authorized to enter the country for reasons like criminal records, ties to terrorism, or previous immigration violation. I have put so many translators in so many uncomfortable positions over the years. Two that come to mind. I was working with some ethnic Albanians who we caught red-handed trying to cross illegally, and I was laying out the government's case and explaining the next steps to them. They weren't breaking, a term we use to describe a guilty person's admission of guilt, despite overwhelming evidence. I was trying to break them via the translator, so the translator had to match my accusatory tone. Once they broke, got charged, and I finished up the paperwork, the Albanians left the room, and I was chatting with the translator. We call them, they translate over the phone, and they told me they went to high school with these guys. Long story short, that particular accent was centered in a small town. And as soon as these guys started talking, the translator knew they were from her hometown. Throughout the course of the call, they have to state their full name and job. She said afterwards, she knew the whole family, but they likely have no idea who she is. Crazy small world. Second story. I found CP on this scumbag's phone, and he all of a sudden couldn't speak any English. So I dragged him into an interview room and called the translation service for Greek. The dude had been living in Canada for 20 years. There's no way he didn't speak English, but some people get desperate when cornered. All in Greek. The poor translator, who I'm sure was furiously writing, typing while translating to keep it all straight so he could refer it back to me, had to listen to a 10-minute long death. Confession, including some gruesome details about how the child passed, then had to relay it back to me in English so I could process it as well. Neither of us, myself or the translator, had signed up for that crap, let me tell you. Story 19. I'm an interpreter for a school district working mostly with high schoolers. The most uncomfortable conversation I've ever had to interpret for was teaching a room full of high school boys sex education. I am young and somewhat close to their age, which didn't help at all. I find conversations to be awkward when the English speaker completely ignores whoever I am interpreting for and just talks to me and looks at me the whole time. Like I am not the one here who is having the conversation with you. Please treat them like you would any other person you are talking to. Story 20. Not a translator, but I use their assistance all the time at the hospital. The worst was telling a family their loved one just passed, then having to wait like 10 seconds for the interpreter to say it. Then the family is distraught and crying and asking questions, and you have to slowly interpret everything back and forth. Story 21. This is a different sort of uncomfortable than it seems like you're asking about, but damn it, might as well share. My career as a translator was neither brilliant nor comfortable, and I'm very glad it's over. My last job as a translator was on a book about some new age topic that was pretty ridiculous to begin with. It was also my first big job as a translator, and I made rather poor decisions. One of which was agreeing that my payment for the book would be a percentage of the sales and nothing else. It was a good percentage, but still a dumb idea. I had to pretend to be into the new age thing too, which wasn't too hard as I knew someone else who was involved, but really I just wanted to be able to put a book on my resume. I get to work, all bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, but my enthusiasm doesn't last long because this woman was making me translate not an original manuscript, but a translation of the original, which she had written Dutch, and then translated herself into English. Now, I don't know if she was any good as an author, but I can tell you she was a god-awful translator. You can't just fancy yourself a translator because you're pretty good at another language, and yet this is exactly what she had done. There were whole passages that felt as though she had simply put them through Google Translate that I had to physically copy out and parse, like I do for Latin in order to understand them. It was the most headache-inducing thing I've ever, including my present course of study in medieval languages. But the worst thing was that once I had finished, sent the thing off, and thanked my stars, that I had nothing more to do other than await my percentage of the sales. The New Age type organization she had written the book for, of her own initiative, decided that they didn't want it published, expelled her from their ranks, and forbade any version of the book from ever being mentioned ever again. I translated 260 pages of nonsense for literally nothing. Another time, I accepted a job translating a friend of a friend's poems. They were not good poems. In fact, they were really bad poems, and it was really hard to stop myself from subtly making the English versions just a tiny bit less cringy. I think she noticed because she got a friend of hers to reread my work, do her own translation, and ultimately she told me that since I had done half the work, I'd get half the pay, which sucked. But I gladly accepted because it sucked less than working on her crap poetry. Story 22? Not me, but my grandfather's translator. A little backstory for you. Gramps, on Dad's side, didn't speak much English. Gran, on Mom's side, had been inserting herself into both of her daughters' marriages. In the past, she caused one unlucky fellow, my aunt, her daughter, married, to have a bad run-in with the police. She continued to insert herself into my aunt's other marriage. Said aunt was hat by her husband and she passed away. Details are fuzzy for me, but it may have had something to do with something Gran said to initiate it. Aunt and her second husband were fighting at their house alone afterwards. This story takes place when my parents and grandparents, both sides, were at a Children's Protective Services, CPS, meeting. So my parents, my grandparents, the caseworker, a translator, and I think another CPS employee were in a room discussing the next steps to help my mom to stop drinking and provide a better home environment for us kids. Some words were thrown by my mom's lunatic mother who was hollering about whatever, blaming my dad for this and his parents for that and how she misses her deceased daughter, so she is very emotional. My Gramps turned to the translator and said something in Italian. Gramps' wife and my dad understand and are surprised. The translator shook to the core. The translator was shocked. Face was white, and he insisted he couldn't repeat what Gramps just said. Gramps insisted. Translator refused. Gramps said, "Say it or I'll get someone else to." The translator refused again. Gramps turned to Gran, pointed a finger and shook it at her and declared, "You're the reason your daughter is pass." Gran lost it, ranted and raved and hollered to the point where she got kicked out of the meeting. CPS then told my parents they needed to divorce. Story 23. I'm a bilingual rep for a company, so for the most part, I have to deal with whatever crap the customer dishes out myself. For example, I had one customer who told me that he was sincerely disappointed, as in pissed, with my customer service because the other girl who supports the language and I were non-native speakers, and he wanted a real native to support him. Basically, it was a case of, sorry, bro. However, the most awkward moment so far happened today, and it was between a French customer and my translator. I know enough French to be dangerous, so I could understand enough of the conversation between them, which basically boiled down to them calling each other idiots because the customer thought that the translator told me the wrong spelling of his name. They were actually fighting while I'm sitting there as the third party thinking to myself, should I break it up? I decided the best course of action was to not employ my rusty French, could have made things worse, and browse other open cases while they worked it out. Story 24. I used to work in forensic psych. The staff office was on the floor, and it had to be kept locked if nobody was in there, so the patients couldn't come in and take things to make weapons. So one evening, I worked swing, There was an ASL-trained social worker in the office talking to a deaf patient. The tech was in there with them doing some work while they sat in the corner. Eventually, the tech got up and left the office, locking it behind him and leaving the female SW locked up with a male forensic psych patient. Eventually, I got a call from a very upset, demanding to know why she had been locked in the office with a potentially violent patient. I went to find the tech to find out what happened. He said they were off in the corner, not speaking, and he just forgot they were there and left. Story 25. Twice. I had to have an explicit encounter between two students translated to their very Muslim parents. Once it was male and female, the other was male and male. I warned the translator what I had to share prior because she spoke a number of dialects, languages, and we wanted to make sure we said the correct words. Story 26. Translator here. Probably the time when I had to explain to a patient that she had a pussel infection. I had to stand next to her and watch her fully naked. Oh, and also in a meeting between a governor, a ministry, officials, and a Chinese company where I was working as an interpreter, and the words started mixing up. And I went full blank mode and started stuttering and just stood there for a while. Somehow, I managed to work it out. Story 27. Working as a manager on a Tokyo-Sydney flight, and as the only Japanese speaker on the crew, had to translate for an Aussie doctor who came forward to assist when we found one of our Japanese PACs unconscious on the bathroom floor. Turned into a very weird situation, very quickly. The patient, passenger in question, was a newlywed Japanese lady who couldn't speak for herself due to the whole unconscious thing. But her new husband was very concerned that the sex the night before might be the problem. He wanted me to translate to the DR in very detailed and specific language, exactly what his concerns were. His knowledge of her type 1, insulin-dependent diabetes, was apparently non-existent. He didn't mention it at all when we asked about pre-existing conditions or medications she might be taking. Just kept talking about their sex experience the night before, how she reacted, whether she liked it, he thought she had, but now wasn't sure, whether he should have given her more notice, apparently there was some fecal leakage, etc. Weirdest situation ever. Luckily, we found her blood glucose testing kit in the seat pocket at her seat and were able to work out what had happened. Turns out she was having a serious, but easily managed, hypoglycemic episode. She hadn't eaten for over 24 hours, but still took usual amounts of insulin, hoping to lose weight before her planned photos in bikini at Aussie beaches. She recovered quickly after treatment, but he still kept insisting that he was sure the sex played a part. It was like the dude had some serious fixation on it. We weren't sure whether he was bragging or genuinely concerned. He was just so weird about it. Even when she had recovered and was able to communicate for herself that it had nothing to do with her current situation. In embarrassment, she moved seats to another section of the plane and wouldn't let him sit with her. She refused to speak with him at all, and then she bolted from the plane without him after landing. We later saw him still searching for her at the baggage carousel. She'd apparently already picked up her bag and left. Can only imagine how the rest of that honeymoon played out. Story 28. My family used to have a boot store located at Traders Village out here in Dallas. Our next-door neighbor, a Mexican woman well into her 80s, had a shop where she sold all kinds of things: bicycles, toys, old books, etc. One day, a 13-year-old me is minding his own business, helping clean up our store, when my mom tells me to go see what all is going on with the next-door neighbor since she heard people raise their voices. I reluctantly go over there and per my mom's orders. I ask if everything is okay or if I can somehow help. The situation was this. Our neighbor, an older woman who I thought didn't speak a word of English, sold the parents of a rather hefty kid a bicycle earlier that day. The bicycle apparently went kaput almost immediately after this beefy boy started to ride around on it. The parents came in to complain that our neighbor had sold them a bicycle she knew to be junk and they wanted their money back. This is more or less where I come in, when I show up asking if I could help. In English, the parents immediately started using me as their interpreter and demanded that I tell our neighbor that they want their money back or they'll call police and see what they make of it. My neighbor then turns to the parents and starts talking and says that she can't be blamed for that fat-ass kid being too big for a bicycle. I think the parents caught at least a little of what she said, but they weren't sure what it was since she said it in Spanish. So they turned to me and asked me, demanded more like, if she blamed it on their kid's weight. At this point, I turned silent. The neighbor tells me to tell them exactly what she said, and the parents, who have pretty much figured out what she said, are just waiting for me to actually say it and confirm what they already knew. At this point, I tell the parents that I don't even work there and that I don't want any part of whatever is happening. The mom of the kid realizes what an uncomfortable situation I was in and apologized for the situation they brought me into. I went back to my parents' store and I told my mom to never volunteer me for anything like that ever again. In the end, the parents ended up getting shafted since the lady had a all sales final sign, and there's really not much anyone can do that would be worth any more time and effort. I came to find out sometime later that our neighbor spoke English the whole time, but she found it much easier to pretend to only speak or understand a few words when dealing with people who don't speak Spanish. Story 29. My time has come. I used to work as a corporate personal interpreter for visiting executives. What the personal means is that my job didn't end with the workday. I would go around with these execs from morning to night, and sometimes through the night, depending on their plans, just interpreting, translating whatever they needed. This included any leisure activities. And wow, executives visiting Japan sure leap to wanting to find sex as soon as they can. They'd make sure I signed an NDA, and off we would head to a red light district. The most awkward situation I was in was with a drunk exec who wanted to have sex with the hostess of the club we were in. She wasn't interested and was only humoring him, but I had to sit there for something like an hour as he started sweet-talking her, and then moved on to outright, blatantly sexual stuff. As she was dodging this, he was getting more and more angry and belligerent and started directing it at me because she would obviously be falling all over him. A fat, sloppy, 60-something exec with more of a resemblance to Trump than not. If he had a better interpreter, I should make it up to him by having sex with him instead. And then he decided to call up one of the company directors he had met with earlier in the day to yell at them, through me, about how awful an interpreter I was because they promised him I would make sure he didn't have to worry about any language barriers. But now I wouldn't sleep with him and wouldn't interpret well enough to get the other girl too. There were countless times I had to interpret execs talking dirty to girls and explain that the sex trade rules were no penetration, with them getting upset about it. But they usually didn't try to force me to have sex with them instead or make me call up the director to tell him I wouldn't. Story 30? Not me, but a dear friend was a refugee when she came to the US fleeing the Bosnian genocide. She was brought into the interpretation business out of necessity, assisting fellow refugees with communication throughout the process of being granted asylum, finding apartments, entering the workforce, etc. Over time, she got all of her certifications, but just last year, she up and switched careers, quit her job and matriculated as a full-time MA student in a completely different field, in a city 2 hours away, and she commutes every day. About a month ago, she told me the real reason for this abrupt change in life trajectory. She'd been hired as the court interpreter for a fellow Bosniak refugee, one whom she'd known a long time, but whose story she wasn't familiar with. My friend was charged with listening to him regale his and his son's suffering before a judge, then translate it into English for all to hear. She said that usually, her policy when helping fellow refugees in a courtroom setting was be a chair. She avoided emotional involvement out of her own necessity, but this case was too much for her. She saw it through, but immediately started hunting for a new job. Story 31. Not a translator, but my mom was a dispatcher for a translation agency for a while. Most awkward incident was when she had to explain to a woman why she couldn't get them an ASL translator over the phone. Story 32. The company I work for has a Spanish translation team that I use very frequently and know all of them. We basically do customer service. The most awkward conversations is when you have an irate person on the other line that is cussing you out. Our translators are supposed to translate word for word unless vulgar language is used. Then they can summarize. Basically, what I hear is about a minute of someone screaming at me, using multiple choice words that I can recognize as curse words. Then the translator translating essentially, they are not happy with your answer. It's awkward for everyone because the translator is basically getting yelled at and has nothing to do with anything other than he picked up that call. And I have to just sit there for minutes at a time, listening to someone scream and a short 5-word translation. The customer usually catches on after the first tirade or two that there is no point and they should just calm down and be a decent human being and talk it out. Story 33. I'm an ASL interpreter at Video Relay Call Center, and I have had to interpret plenty of uncomfortable conversations. But most recently, I had my first phone sex call. Story 34. A deaf middle schooler I was interpreting for was making the sign for pussy and putting in front of their face and pretending to lick it, basically saying, "eat pussy" in ASL. They saw me looking and stopped doing it, but otherwise I would have had to voice that in front of about 100 middle schoolers, because there was no one else there who could understand ASL. Closest call I've ever had. Note for anyone worried about me not voicing, there were situational reasons for it because of the deaf child's IEP. In addition, children are often still learning how to use interpreters, so I would give them a chance to stop saying whatever they're saying before voicing it with no warning. Story 35. Different Spanish-speaking countries have vastly different definitions of concha, pendejo, malando, etc., etc. You could be talking about a specific type of bread in one country and lady parts in another. Story 36. Had a mostly non-verbal individual who would sign, and I worked in her home as a home nursing aide. Cool chick who was pretty funny, but also very difficult to understand her handwriting. She loved that I could sign, and we would often use fingerspelling and adapted sign. She had her own gestures like the letter C and make cat ears for cat. I would come in, and she and I would have coffee and figure out our day using paper and pen and sign language. We had a really obnoxious staff who did not sign. He would speak to the client in baby talk and often misunderstand her writing. One morning, he worked the overnight, and I was coming in on day shift. My lady had the coffee on, paper, and pen, and was waiting for me to chat it up. My staff was trying too hard to tell me all about his hard work the evening before. My patient just sat there the entire time he was talking to me, signing, "He is stupid. He does not listen to me. He is stupid. Big, big dummy," in broken sign and finger spelling. Hardest thing to not sit and laugh as this a hole was telling me about scrubbing the floors. She told me he fell asleep in the chair again overnight, and he should be fired. I had to report it to the office manager, who also came over and could sign. It was hilarious, and oh, so awkward. He was fired after he got a warning. I don't think he ever figured out that our patient was able to sign so well, and was how we found out. Story 37. When I first became a RN back in the early 90s, I heard of a case where a housekeeper was translating to a patient going to have surgery. The patient was a non-compliant diabetic that developed a diabetic foot ulcer that would not heal. The medical team tried to treat her wound, but would not heal due to the patient's non-compliance and uncontrolled diabetes. The patient was going septic and the foot needed to be amputated. The housekeeper was the one that was translating that her foot needs to be amputated, but did not have the heart to tell that to the patient. She would say that they were just going to loss the ulcer off. The housekeeper could not bring it to herself to actually say that your whole foot was coming off, even though she understood completely what she was translating. Patient signs consent, and foot is amputated. Patient wakes up and freaks out that her foot was amputated. This probably happened in the 80s. Now there are strict guidelines. We can only use global interpreters or hospital interpreters that went to a special class and passed the exam, which was hard for naive speakers of that language. No housekeepers, family members, or nursing staff cannot translate for specific surgeries or risky procedures. Story 38. I worked phone support for a cell company for some years, and for customers who don't speak English, we have an interpreter service. We basically conference the interpreter into the call and take turns speaking. Makes the call longer, but it gets the job done. One memorable call had my interpreter flustered as I had to explain to an Arabic man that he did not have insurance on his last phone and would need to pay full price for a replacement. I remember the interpreter's anxiousness at translating the rudeness very well. Interpreter: the customer say that he say that, oh my very goodness, he say you a very rude man. When I get really beside myself, I'll mutter, oh my very goodness. Story 39. Parents are deaf and am a sign language interpreter. I work for a certain video phone, think Skype, where the deaf people can see me, I make calls for them, and I interpret said call. Company, and every now and then I will pick up night hours. Like nightlife, some of the strangest and most interesting calls come up. One evening, a deaf girl calls her hearing boyfriend, must have been long distance based on phone numbers, and it starts as a normal convo, but after about 30 minutes of awkward small talk, the girl starts asking if he misses her, she misses him, she misses his smell, his manhood. Now, I'm a male interpreter and I'm trying not to lose it. At the same time, I feel bad for the git because he has to listen to this guy with a deep voice telling him that I miss how you feel inside me. Like a champ, he doesn't miss a beat and continues with the convo. Night call, different day, really old deaf guy. Must be lonely and horny because he makes a call to Adam and Eve. Crap, I don't know what the protocol is. I know that the FCC regulates our call policy, but I don't know about this one. So I humor the guy and the dude goes on to order. I don't remember the real names as this was a few years ago, but similar, I think. Ass Blasters, Muff Divers, and Daddy Bear. Again, not the name, but you get the idea. That last one threw me, but he was insistent that they had it and double-checked they added it. My boss said that I should have politely explained that we do not make those calls. I wish I would have known sooner. Story 40. I translate for my job and my family as I happen to have the highest level of English. Family. In middle school, some of my family members were applying for green cards. There was a time when this was a huge fad in Asia. 13-year-old me was trying to wade through legalese and convert it to Chinese. My Chinese wasn't that good at the time, so let's just say it was very painful, huh? The most awkward situation was when I had to write, and then interpret conversations that my relatives didn't want their green cards anymore. Also another fad that swept Asia. Tough as nails, and how do you explain nicely to an American Gov employee that all these applicants no longer want to be part of our wonderful nation? Job. I now translate Chinese web fiction serials into English, and most of them are run-of-the-mill martial arts, palace drama, action and romance, etc. The overt sexism kills me sometimes, especially for novels with female protagonists. You get gems like, what could she, a woman, do? And insert a million scenarios that have nothing to do with her gender. Or like a typical woman. or women and backstabbers are the two types of people to never associate with, or the absence of any knowledge is a woman's greatest virtue, or she was just a woman, her mind filled only with thoughts of love and chivalry, etc. I'm not even trying here. These are just examples I typed off the top of my head. Story 41. There is a service called TI, which is used to help people who are hearing impaired have phone conversations with hearing people. Not used as much these days because people mostly just text each other, but is still used if a company or service doesn't have an online chat option. Anyway, I used to work for a call center that provided the TI services for my province. There used to be a couple who would call in and have phone sex every Thursday night at a certain time. It was awesome. As a rite of passage, we used to keep it a secret and put the newbies on Thursday nights when we knew the couple would be calling in. A bit of a hazing ritual, if you will. We had fun. Story 42. Not an interpreter, but when I did a study program in a foreign country, we had one of the students translate the teacher's feedback to our group on a big project. Our group did our project at the last minute, and the teacher was so critical about our assignment, the student refused to translate the teacher's comments because they were so harsh. Our project was awful, and the presentation was embarrassing as duck. But I had a lot of fun in the country, so I can laugh about it now. Story 43. My husband is a CODA, child of deaf adults. He used to go to the movies with his parents and sit in between them and sign for them. Yeah. The steamy car scene in Titanic is always awkward for a young child to explain to his parents. Story 44. Not a translator, but I do English grammar editing for scientific manuscripts, and much of my work is translated into English. One of my favorite misspellings is of the word analyze. Analyze is acceptable if the manuscript is in United Kingdom English. However, analyze is a whole other thing entirely. Story 45. Damn it! I finally have a story to share. I grew up in Mexico to missionary parents, so we would get a lot of American groups with doctors that would go to the local villages to do medical checkups. Since I'm bilingual, I would be their translator a lot of the time, even though I was just like 13 years old. I really enjoyed doing it. And for the most part, it was minor issues that the patients had, but one in particular does come to mind. It must have been a lady in her late 60 years old, or younger, but just poor so they don't age as well, that came in to get a checkup. Her problem was basically that her uterus was falling out and would not stay up inside her. I had to mediate this conversation between a doctor and this woman, trying to describe the feeling when she would shove it back up inside her pussy. I guess it turns out that after a lot of children and old age, it is just something that can just happen. Needless to say, 13-year-old me was pretty uncomfortable. Story 46. My ex was Hungarian, and his mother spoke zero English. He was about 13 years old when she got pregnant with his brother, and he had to interpret at all her hospital appointments. I can't imagine he was comfortable having to ask the doctor if it was okay for her to have sex while pregnant. Story 47. I have worked for Illinois Department of Early Intervention for the past 15 years. From time to time, I get assigned to go for medical evaluations for certain cases, and the most uncomfortable one for me had to be about 3 years ago. The child was diagnosed with autism, but the mother refused to listen to the therapists and pediatric doctor. She cried and kept saying her son didn't have it. This went on for about 15 minutes until they explained to her and her husband the future of the child, and the good thing about being diagnosed early on in his life. Story 48. I'm not a translator, but my late CL had her voice box removed and some horrendously drastic brain surgery, which left her with a very shrunken, deformed, and scarred mouth and nose to try to get rid of a very rare and aggressive cancer. I can lip read, so I used to be the one who dealt with official things and doctors, etc. One night I was cleaning her stoma. Her hubby and Bill were sitting telling her all the local gossip, and out of the blue, she asked him a question. My heart sank. Do you still love me? He looked at me and asked what she said, so I repeated it for him. And he took hold of her hands and told her he had always loved her and would always love her. Even like this, looking like this. She gestured to her face, and he confirmed that he always would love her and that she was beautiful. Will you marry somebody else after I'm dead? No, of course I won't be said. Will you pick out my favorite songs? I really like my girl and make sure they put me in my purple dress. I can't tell you what he replied to that because I had to leave the ward. I cried for about an hour. She passed away 5 days later, and 16 years later, I still cry thinking about that conversation. Story 49. I'm late to the party, but here goes 8 years ago. I worked as interpreter for a major, if not the biggest, house appliance company and distributor in Indonesia. They hired me for their weekly evaluation meeting between KU, sometimes CFO and CEO also there, head of sales department and their branch managers from all over the country. It's an evaluation meeting. Targets, sales numbers, percentage, and all kind of performance indicators are discussed. They also discussed sales strategies and all kinds of marketing and promotion for the week, month. But main part of the meeting is to scold the branch managers who did not meet their target. At one of the meeting, the KU, not happy with the performance of one branch manager, asked, "What is your plan for next month?" And the branch manager said, I'm focusing on next week's sales target, which replied by the coup to all the branch managers. All of you are idiots, which I have to translate. Now, I'm not even graduated yet from my university back then. So, I calmly translate, you all are not smart, which then quickly corrected by the head of sales, Indonesia, saying he, coup, means all of you are idiots. Left that job a month after that incident, can't handle the stress. Haha. Story 50. I played soccer at a university that happened to have a very large deaf program, so we attracted some of the best deaf players in the country. This one particular guy played center mid. Yay, in the middle of the field where most people depend very much on hearing your teammates pretty much all the time, as a 100% deaf person. And he still became an academic All-American, conference player of the year, etc. Dude had a spider sense. Anyways, we have this 45-year-old lovely woman, bless her heart, with 22 years old athletes at all times for practices and game stuff, traveling, etc. She translated some crazy, immature, inappropriate things with grace and humor on many an occasion. But the one that sticks out was when we were stretching before a game and someone ripped ass so loudly that literally everyone looked over and started laughing. Without skipping a beat, she performed the sign for a fart, which is blowing into your thumb like it's a glove balloon and wiggling all your fingers as if gas is passing through them, causing a whole new level of laughter to erupt. Damn hilarious. But she did everything she could to make sure they didn't miss any of the joking and fun times. Great lady. Noteworthy afterthought. After the season, we got him stoned and he could see our mouths moving and could actually hear the words, haha. Also, there are very weird noises in a deaf dormitory. Story 51. I'm a medical interpreter for patients during doctor office and hospital visits. One of my most favorite moments would have to be when this pregnant woman was being seen for her regular checkup. Her husband was with her, and they were finding out the sex. So after about an hour and a half of getting images of the baby in all types of positions, the doctor points out that it's a boy. They're all excited and stuff. Then the guy turns to the girl and they start whispering. I can hear them clearly, but because they never spoke to me or the doctor directly, I chose to ignore them. The guy wanted to know how large the baby's junk was. I was mortified, hoping that he wouldn't ask me to translate that because I couldn't figure out the best way to translate it so I wouldn't sound creepy. So he then turns to me and straight up asks me to ask the doctor to see his junk. So I turn to the doctor and I start stammering like, well, they'd like to confirm that it's a male. I broke all protocol at that point because we are supposed to translate word for word exactly everything that is said. The doctor looks at me and says, he wants to see the baby's junk, huh? And I'm like, yeah. And she says, trust me, we get that a lot. Story 52. Slight aside to this, my mom was a sign language interpreter. I came home from school one day, and as soon as I entered the house, I could hear my mom's voice coming from upstairs. As I walked up the stairs, it became clearer, but it made no sense. What I was hearing was my mom in a very weird monotone, saying a lot of really bad words, and on and on. It was bizarre. I sort of slunk past, into my room, not wanting to get involved in whatever was happening. I should add, my mom was, and is to this day, very religious, so this made even less sense. When she did eventually come out of her room, she was shocked to see that I was home, and tentatively asked if I had heard her. I turned beet red, and then so did she. She sat down on my bed and explained that she had been called in to translate for the police and at trials and hospitals, etc., and often found herself at a loss for how to translate certain things, and often found herself just spelling out curse words, which sort of takes the sting out of them, dilutes their meaning. So she had recorded herself saying every curse word she knew, and was practicing translating them alone in her room. Story 53. I don't work as an interpreter, but I know a couple of other languages, and I had unluckily came across a distressed woman who was frantic and agitated. She was trying to talk to a cop of how she was abused and lots of other horrible things that some a hole did to her. So as I was passing by, I heard him say that he didn't even know what language she was speaking and kept asking her to calm down, which she didn't obviously cause she could not understand him. After a few painful seconds, I manned up and asked if she was okay, which she was relieved to hear that I understood her and asked if I could translate. I told her that I'm not fluent, but I can get by easily. I'm normally a cold guy, but damn did my heart go out to her. The officer thanked me and asked if I could be with her till a professional came, and I agreed. I did not want to hear the details, but she really let it all out. Story 54. I worked on a pregnancy risk assessment survey, conducting Spanish and English surveys. A 16-year-old girl who only spoke Spanish explained to me how she was abused. I had to write down everything she said, verbatim, and wasn't allowed to say anything comforting to her, despite knowing the feeling of abuse as well. Sadly, cases like hers weren't all too rare in the scope of the project. Story 55. So at a sign language interpreters conference I went to, I did a clinic on assisting individuals who are deaf-blind. Use of ASL to describe things gets interesting and sometimes borderline intimate when doing hand over hand. Imagine rapid facial, body touches while clasping hands with someone else. Well nearing the end of the clinic, and we're all feeling pretty comfortable with each other when the woman leading the clinic decides to relate her favorite tale. She had a client contract her for interpreting and navigation services one evening. After running some errands, he rather sheepishly informed her that he had always wanted to go to a strip club. She, being a good sport, agreed to go. While explaining what then ensued, she grabbed my hands to demonstrate her client and proceeded to show the room how she had translated what the women were doing on stage into motions with her hands. Apparently, the client had a very good time. I was a little red-faced at having essentially soft-core adult film fed into my hands in front of a room full of people. Story 56. In 2016, I was working in a hotel in Venezuela when the Non-Aligned Movement Summit happened. Being one of the few people that could speak English at the front desk, I had most of the interactions with the people from the delegations. Most of them had their own interpreters, but during the night audit shifts, I had a lot of delegates from China, North Korea, and several countries from the Middle East come to the front desk to ask about escort, how much they charged, and what services they provided. We were one of the fancy hotels on the island, and they were upset we didn't have a list of prostitutes ready to serve. Apparently, the most used service during the summit was male escorts, according to other FDAs I knew from other hotels. Story 57. Many years ago, an American participant in an international program that I was running in a Hispanic country passed suddenly of a heart attack. His wife happened to be on the program too, and was present when it happened. While we were waiting for the coroner's van, which was coming from a larger town, I thought of calling the local priest since I knew both the deceased and his wife were Catholics. When the priest showed up, he turned out to be the most inappropriate, awkward, and unconcerned person I have ever seen in such situation. He was talking to the wife with total lack of empathy or interest about her feelings. I was translating for him, and I had to make up the whole translation. Because I was so ashamed of the words of the priest, he would say things like, "I was in the middle of my lunch when you called me," and I would translate, "I could not wait to come comfort you when I heard of this tragedy." The whole thing was so sad. The wife was very appreciative that I had called the priest, but all the comfort words were mine. Story 58. I was called to the lab to help a patient register for understand and drop off his semen analysis following his vasectomy. I am a female. As we were finishing up the interaction, I asked the patient if he needed anything else. Your number. The lab has our number, their interpreter team, and can get us if anything else is needed or to call you for results. No, I need your number. Sorry, but I don't give out my personal number to patients. Q guy, putting sunglasses on inside, under the fluorescent hospital lights, and awkwardly trying to get out of there as fast as possible. It still took at least 5 minutes before he was done confirming everything with the lab team. Story 59. I briefly worked remotely as a proofreader for a Korean newspaper that was working on a big tourism promotion project. Basically, bilingual Koreans would translate some spiel about "come visit Korea." Their crafty English draft got sent off to me. I fixed it up and sent it back. These articles always had wild claims like, "Seoul is the only city in the world where the majority of the population lives in high-rise apartments," or "Korea is the only country with 4 distinct seasons. This is South Korea." You would think this kind of ethnocentric bullcrap would be a product unique to the North, but apparently not. Proofreading these was so awkward for me because I wanted to straight up say, "No, it damn isn't." But I kept my mouth shut because it was good money as a university student. Story 60. I was translating during a divorce trial. You have to swear that you're translating to the best of your ability. Just like a witness swears that they're telling the truth. No sweat. You're pretty much a machine. You just translate whatever they say. So the judge, clerk, attorneys, and husband and wife hear what is being said. Well, at one point the accusation comes out that he was sleeping around. Well, the husband loses it and starts cursing up a storm, calling her an escort, etc. Well, I just translated what he said the best I could. Eyebrows were raised and I just shrugged my shoulders. Just doing my job. The judge reprimanded him, the wife was testifying at the time, and the guy yells back at me asking what did I say. The judge was cool and winked at me. It was awkward, but he did tell me afterwards that I did a great job. Story 61. When I was in law school, I volunteered as a Spanish-English interpreter at a legal clinic that helped asylum seekers in their deportation proceedings. We had to have all of our meetings in detention centers, jails, and I often had to interpret truly horrific stories about gang abuse, police brutality. Story 62. I answered a call where someone was translating for a deaf person. They type so the translator can talk. The deaf guy wanted one of our employees' number. I refused because the deaf guy had already stopped by the office, and we had explained to him that we couldn't disclose that info. The translator then told us he said he was going to hit us. The translator then apologized and ended the conversation. Story 63. My mom is a sign language interpreter, and she's the most sweet as pie mom you can imagine. I've never seen her take a single sip of alcohol. I'm 30 years old. She says things like, "Oh, darn." She told me about one time interpreting on the psych ward at the hospital. The deaf patient was throwing chairs at the doctor and signing every obscenity you can think of. and many that don't even have an actual sign to them. And, as an interpreter should, my American sweet as pie mommy had to aggressively cuss the doctor out word for word. It was the best thing I could ever picture. I was dying laughing. Story 64. I'm not an interpreter, but my sister is deaf. We often hire her interpreters for events when my mother, who is fluent more so than I, won't have the time to. My grandfather passed away and we scheduled an interpreter for the funeral, so my mom didn't have to worry. I could tell the interpreter was a little uncomfortable, but that she wanted to properly translate what was being said. Sometime during the service, the interpreter shed a few tears and made eye contact with a few family members. So I was ready for her to leave quickly when it was all over, but she stayed and kept interpreting. My grandmother ended up telling the interpreter that the only reason she was able to sit through the whole funeral was because she was watching her and found her signing comforting. Probably an awkward and uncomfortable experience for her, but it meant the world to my family. Story 65. When I was about 6 months old, my mom, sister, and I moved to the U.S. My dad was already here and going to college. My mom and sister, 6 years old, didn't speak English at this point. Well, there was a lady who was learning French, who was going to be taking care of my sister and I guess teaching her English. Well, this lady wanted to call my mom to let her know that she met my sister. In her novice French, she told my mom, "I hit your daughter with my car," instead of, "I met your daughter in my car." My mom started crying and thought I brought my child to this country to be hit by a car. Why is this woman so happy? My mom then called my dad to tell him what happened. My dad, being a rational person, knew that no one would call and say that, so he called the daycare language story and straightened that out. Story 66. I had to listen to someone draw their last breath as I asked them what happened. I've had to deliver news to a new father that his newborn was being taken off life support. I've had to tell a woman in South America that the bank in the United States mailed her life savings to the wrong address and that there was nothing she could do about it. I think one of the most uncomfortable conversations was listening to a lady talk about how granddaughter was eating her own poop because of the trauma she was going through at home with her abusive parents. The worst part is that we were put on hold and I wasn't allowed to talk unless I was interpreting. So this poor woman was venting about all of these horrible things going on with her daughter and granddaughter and how she's trying to get her daughter arrested. It was horrible. Story 67. I was a Russian translator for a refugee clinic while studying the language at college. It was okay because most of the time I just helped make doctor's appointments or work interviews or whatever pretty basic stuff I could handle. Then one day, I had to take a couple to the courthouse to get a marriage license. I made it through translating pretty smoothly. Then the guy at the courthouse asked if either person had any illnesses, meaning long-term, infectious type things. I only knew how to say sickness in terms of short-term colds or how to say specific illnesses. I asked the husband-to-be if he was sick, like AIDS or something. Ooh boy, the husband-to-be was very confused and offended. We got through it and they got their marriage license. Ura. Story 68. My aunt went to a doctor because she wasn't feeling well. She doesn't speak that much English, so she requested a language interpreter. The interpreter was a young guy who moved to the US when he was a kid. Anyways, doctor asked questions. Interpreter interpreted, my aunt answered. Up until one question after the doctor asked, the interpreter paused, thought about the question and looked at my 60-year-old conservative, religious aunt and asked, "Does your pussy feel any discomfort?" Story 69. I'm not an interpreter, but a public librarian. I have a gentleman from Poland who comes in and asks questions related to English. He does crossword puzzles or watches subtitled movies and writes down words he doesn't understand and then comes in and we explain them. The other day he asked what a sex toy was, and that was a bit awkward. Story 70. I used to translate in college for extra money, and one couple who hired me were trying to complete an adoption application. They kept asking me how I would answer the questions. Questions about how they would raise the child, thoughts on school activities, amounts of TV allowed, etc. Things I had no idea how to answer. I ended up translating all the questions in writing and telling them to give me a call if they needed more help. I didn't hear from them again. If I remember, it was grandparents trying to adopt their daughter's child. Story 71. My grandmother on my father's side only speaks Spanish, and I'm ashamed to admit I never fully mastered it. I grew up in Nye, and she lived in K, so we didn't spend much time together in my youth. Fast forward to 20 years later, I now also live in K. She had an incident where she ended up in the hospital, and with the rest of the family being still in Amie, I went to the hospital to check on her and brought my boyfriend and his brother, who speaks fluent Spanish, to translate. I asked my boyfriend's brother to ask my grandma what happened, and he turns beet red and starts to nervously laugh. Turns out she had to have a mesh put in due to a UTI, but she told him, "My pussy fell out." Story 72. Sign language interpreter here. I'm nationally certified and also have a state legal license, so I do legal interpreting from time to time. Was interpreting for a deposition. Keep in mind, there have been many meetings between this deaf client and her attorneys with several different interpreters over the course of months to reach the point of a deposition. After 3 hours of getting nowhere, the questioning attorney asks why the deaf person even filed this lawsuit. The deaf client responds, "What's a lawsuit?" Her attorney almost fell out of his chair. I thought my head was going to explode. Story 73 might not be seen because I'm pretty late, but I once had to help my friend who is deaf break up with her boyfriend of a couple of months. He didn't know sign language that well, which was a reason she wanted to break up with him. He cried and I felt so bad saying those words, even if I wasn't the ones doing the actions. Story 74. When I studied abroad, my roommate, another American, didn't speak Spanish very well, and our host mom only knew a handful of words in English. I tended to be the dinner table interpreter. One day our host mom was listing off the words she knew in English. One of them was sugar. Being an elderly woman who has never really spoken anything but Spanish, her pronunciation wasn't perfect, but understandable. My roommate started laughing and told me it sounds like she's saying sewer. My host mom asked me what she said. I had to translate that and see the look of sadness on my host mom's face. She was so proud of her English words, and that roommate made her feel insecure. It still makes me angry thinking about it. Story 75. For my first interpreting job, I had to interpret several times at meetings between the heads of our different office branches, and the two people absolutely loathed each other. While neither one of them spoke the other's language, the intense dislike they had for each other was so strong that they didn't need me to understand where they stood in the other's esteem. They would constantly drop little quips like, "He's just so unqualified, a monkey could do his job better," or "She needs to go back to her own country so she can ruin a business there instead of here," while they were sitting across from each other during one-on-one meetings. It was an unspoken rule that I wouldn't translate these insults and just do my best to smooth things over in the interpretation. Story 76. I translate various legal documents from Japanese to English and translated family court reports for an English-speaking foreigner about how his Japanese ex-wife had taken their kids, remarried with a Japanese guy, and then refused to allow the biological father to see his own kids. The worst part was translating transcripts of interviews with the new Japanese husband who casually mentioned how the kids call him dad. And it would be confusing for the kids if they were to suddenly learn about another father figure, that is, learn about their biological father. The crazy thing is that the Japanese court agreed with the new father, and the foreigner father was granted a monitored meeting with his own child, but was not allowed to say who he was. That was hard to translate for a foreign father not used to the Japanese culture. Story 77. I worked for a while at a free mental health clinic as a therapist. I'm a guy, and my client was a Somalian-speaking woman. The first session I had with her, I had a female interpreter, and it went great. During the second session, the usual female interpreter we used was out, so we used this new Somalian male interpreter. During the therapy session, the interpreter was becoming more disinterested in what my client was trying to say to me. The session culminated in the translator, "Yeah, she's just saying some crazy female things. You really don't need to know what she's saying." Story 78. I used to do transcribing for the hearing impaired on the phone. Any conversation you imagine, I had to do it. Luckily, I didn't have to interact with either side, but I did have to listen as a third party. It was rough. It also sucked if you didn't see a movie right away, as you'd have to transcribe people going over the entire plots of movies. Ruined The Dark Knight before I could see it. Story 79. I'm not an interpreter, but I have a short story involving this. I was working for a life insurance company on the inbound customer service line. Lots of elderly people called in. Try keeping your calls short with those. Anyway, we had a contracted translation company that we would bring on the line. I got a caller who I believe spoke Vietnamese. It turned into a complaint call. Can't remember what the issue was, though. At one point, the customer went into a long rant in Vietnamese in response to something I had asked. The interpreter listened and responded with, "She said no?" I tried to get more out of the interpreter, but that's all I got. I have a feeling I was sworn at in Vietnamese. Story 80. Obligatory, not my experience, but my college roommate's, who was fluent in Spanish. We just finished our freshman year, and she got a job at an army camp translating for the Cuban Mariel boat lift in the summer of 1980. She'd barely signed the paperwork when she was shoved into work at the clinic. A doctor thought the guy he was giving a physical to had an STD and wanted her to ask him if he had sores. So she started off with a memorable first day, first translation.